Okay, thank you very much. So my name's Lori Marhofer. I'm an affiliate faculty with the Strom Center and a professor in the history department here at the University of Washington. And welcome to the 2024 Samuel and Althea Strom Lecture in Jewish Studies, the first of two lectures featuring Professor Marion Kaplan. I want to first thank everybody for your flexibility in moving the venue online tonight. And of course, we're tremendously grateful to Professor Kaplan for flying out here, and she is in Seattle, and we're just so sad that we're not in person tonight. As some of you know, we were directed by the provost to move all campus events onto Zoom, including some classes were moved to Zoom this afternoon, because there is an event taking place in the hub that features a right-wing anti-LGBTQ radio host that has become something of a rally outside of the hub. An event involving an outside organization that's taking place on campus. So we were directed by the provost to move all of the events, not just this one. And I apologize for this. And if you can, hopefully you can't, I'm actually on campus and hopefully you can't hear anyone yelling really loud about Jesus, but if you can, please ignore it. That's what's going on. Happily, this is a one-night event. It will not impact Thursday's lecture. So we're very happy that Thursday's lecture with Professor Kaplan will be in person on campus. And we're looking forward to seeing everybody in Kane Hall. And thank you for your flexibility. Let me begin by acknowledging that let me do my second thing, acknowledging that the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. This event is made possible by the generous support of the community of donors of the Strom Center. And many of you are in the audience today, and we thank you from the depth of our hearts. Thank you on behalf of all of us for your generosity. In addition, this event would not be possible without a group of professionals at the Strom Center who work every day to bring quality, thought-provoking academic programming to new audiences. This includes Aliyah Vinakur, Kara Schoonmaker, Grace Elizabeth D, Jenny McCullum, Liv Fowler, and Kahana Isaka. Thank you to all of them for all the work that you did to make this event possible, and also for pivoting to Zoom. That a lot of effort went into this afternoon. Thank you. The talk today will be about 50 minutes, and after that we will have a Q&A, which I'll monitor. So we invite all of you to submit your questions when this happens via the Q&A, which hopefully is obvious to you as to how to do that on Zoom, because actually I don't know. Okay, and now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Marion Kaplan. It's such a pleasure to introduce Professor Kaplan, one of my all-time favorite historians. I'm also a social historian of Germany, and I remember actually reading one of Marion's chapters on my very first day of graduate school, and her work has just been so inspiring to me over the course of my short career. So it's really an honor to have her here, and we're so grateful to her for doing this. Professor Marion Kaplan is the Skirball Professor of Modern Jewish History Emerita at New York University. She's one of the foremost historians of German Jews, as well as one of the most important scholars of women's history of our era. Her work has been transformative in the fields of gender history, social history, and the history of the Holocaust, and has inspired a whole generation of historians. She's the author of a number of books. The Jewish Feminist Movement in Germany, the Campaigns of the Jüdische Frauenbund, 1904 to 1938, published in 1979. She also wrote The Making of the Jewish Middle Class, Women, Family, and Identity in Imperial Germany, published in 1991, which won the American Historical Association Conference Group in Central European History Book Prize for 1991-1992, and the National Jewish Book Award. Her next book, the much beloved Between Dignity and Despair, Jewish Life in Nazi Germany, if you haven't read it, I highly, highly recommend, was published in 1998 and won the Frankel Prize in Contemporary History from the Wiener Library and the Institute of Contemporary History, London. It was named a 1998 notable book by the New York Times and won the National Jewish Book Award. She further edited and contributed to The Marriage Bargain, Women and Dowries in European History, 1985, Jewish Daily Life in Germany, 1618 to 1945, published in 2005, and was co-editor and contributor to the extremely formative collection, one of the most important edited collections in the field, When Biology Became Destiny, When Biology Became Destiny, Women in Weimar and Nazi Germany. as well as Jüdische Welten, Juden in Deutschland from 18. Jahrhundert bis in die Gegenwart of 2005. She is also the author of the outstanding Dominican Haven, the Jewish refugee settlement, and Sosua, 1940 to 1945, which was chosen as a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. Her most recent book, also much praised, is Hitler's Jewish Refugees, Hope and Anxiety in Portugal in 2020. Professor Kaplan has served on the advisory committees of the Museum of Jewish Heritage for its permanent exhibit, as well as exhibits on Jewish resistance in the Holocaust and on Jewish refugees in the Dominican Republic. She teaches modern European history, modern Jewish history, and women's history. She's proudest of her work with young scholars, including in the Holocaust Education Foundation Mentorship Program from 2020 to the present, and she received the Association for Jewish Studies Women Caucus's Mentorship Award in 2022. It is my great honor and pleasure to welcome Professor Marion Kaplan.
Thank you very, very much for such a warm endorsement. I appreciate it. So I'm going to start tonight talking about the complexities of Jewish friendships, Jews and non-Jews in the Kaiserreich or in Imperial Germany. So Imperial Germany opened extraordinary opportunities for Jews politically and economically. Jewish men achieved political rights. According to one happy soul, quote, "Finally, after long fruitless waiting, we've reached a safe harbor." Similarly, a Jewish newspaper rejoiced, quote, "Humankind has progressed. Humanity has triumphed." With the founding of the German Empire, its 512,000 Jews saw a new, more welcoming society. Tonight's talk, then, will explore just how welcoming, as it focuses on grassroots social interactions and, where possible, on the feelings these evoked among Jews of both genders, sometimes heartening, sometimes discouraging. Feelings may not be explicit, however. One may have to read them into reports of acceptance and rejection, and the facts that Jews sardonically document these moments in letters, or many years later in memoirs. Whereas discomfort with Jews, othering, and outright anti-Semitism existed in many non-Jewish circles, not in all, anti-Semitism set limits on Jewish success and also the boundaries against which Jews pushed relentlessly and often successfully. Religious and social anti-Semitism, increasingly accompanied by racism, intensified when heightened by economic and political agitation. Anti-Semitism took on new energy with the stock market crash and the First Great Depression, 1873 to 1896, along with the Christian social movement of Lutheran court chaplain Adolf Stöcker, which successfully promoted political anti-Semitism, including having the Conservative Party commit to anti-Semitism in its platform in the early 1890s. And yet, by the early 20th century, the anti-Semitic parties had seriously declined, although social anti-Semitism lingered. Thus, after the Depression until early in World War I, these were good years for Jews. But were they really? And if so, how and how not? This talk may serve as a reminder of the futility of generalizing about most periods. That is, human beings come in an amazing variety and in a surprising diversity of behaviors and contradictions. Jewish and non-Jewish interactions could depend on a person's age, location, and gender. Jewish children throughout the era had good experiences, despite some disappointments. Older teenagers found more situationally and institutionally produced anti-Semitism in their schools and university. Male students, most women didn't enter until 1908, suffered the most bigotry. Geography, too, played a role, a confusing one. Small towns could be hospitable and friendly. There, Jewish and non-Jewish Germans, especially men, engaged in a variety of leisure, community, and volunteer activities. But as we'll see, boundaries remained. There were greater chances for increasing social interactions in more cosmopolitan cities, including intermarriage. And Jews were central, not peripheral, especially to cultural enterprises. And gender, as always, and as we will see, made differences here and there, not everywhere. I'll try now to show the complexity of Jewish and non-Jewish relationships by looking at the history of daily life, focusing particularly on children in schools and youth at universities, as well as social leisure time activities for adults. Looser, more casual quotidian activities can help us nuance, to see contradictions and ambiguities, and to disentangle multiple strands of social interactions, from hostility to friendship. Although I concentrate on Jews, these moments of acceptance and animosity provide a vantage point from which to study German society too. A variety of German behaviors emerge in the history of Jewish everyday life, from friendships and marriage to condescension and exclusion, forcing us to acknowledge diversity among Germans and inhibiting the temptation to read the history of Jews and Germans backwards from the Holocaust. Nevertheless, behind this research lurks the inescapable and possibly unanswerable question: how did ordinary people who formerly had Jewish friends, neighbors, and even relatives embrace or succumb to Nazism just a few decades later? Before we engage in this examination, we need to remember that friendship has been studied in many disciplines. We can't go into that tonight. We also need to understand that the idea of friendship, or in my definition, mutual caring, is fluid in time, culture, and according to individuals. So, friendship meant different relationships at different times to different people. It's a slippery concept, from deep mutual affection, even love, to a rather distant Facebook friend like today. Also, our sources can be imperfect. Memory can fail at times. Still, although we know that memory, particularly childhood memory, is fallible, the feelings do seem fresh and alive. So let's start with childhood. By the imperial era, the vast majority of Jewish children attended public schools rather than Jewish schools. Friendship between children born between 1880 and 1905 occurred in school and en route to school or after school, although gender differences do not stand out at this stage. Rahel Strauss, born in 1880, attended a secular public school. As a doctor, she later recalled, quote, "Whether our school was good or we learned a lot, I can't say, but that we took comradeship for granted was certainly worth more for the formation of our character than if we learned more of this or that." In fact, school often provided the first opportunity for some Jewish children to meet regularly with non-Jews. One man noted, quote, "Until then, all of my playmates came from Jewish families. School was and long remained the only excursion into the non-Jewish world," end quote. Still, Christianity had vast cultural and religious significance, especially in smaller towns. Toni Ehrlich, born 1880, remembered her shock as a 7-year-old when a classmate asked to provide an example of an accusative verb responded with, "Jews crucified our Savior." Then again, this remained the only significant blemish in her school life, filled with friends from Jewish and Christian backgrounds. And in Laupheim, a smaller town, Herta Nortorf, born in 1895, the only Jew in her class, insisted that greater animosity prevailed between Protestant and Catholic children, recalling being wooed by both sides. On a Catholic holy day, the Catholic children commiserated, "We feel sorry for you that you have to remain with them today." And the Protestant children welcomed her with, "Today is fine, we are completely among ourselves." meaning the Jewish and the Protestant kids. Many Jewish children developed close relationships with non-Jews. Walter Elias, born in 1891, attending school in what he called liberal Königsberg, where 10% of the students were Jewish, counted more non-Jewish than Jewish friends. Similarly, Toni Ehrlich, from an acculturated Breslau family and the only Jew in her class, described unencumbered relationships with many non-Jewish friends, and her sister met her lifelong non-Jewish friend in elementary school. On the other hand, Käthe Frankenthal, born 1889, reported more complicated relationships in Kiel. Whereas non-Jewish classmates enjoyed coming to her home, her parents were easygoing and the house was big enough, her best friend did not invite Käthe to her birthday party. The wealthy hostess had included all of the little guests' moms, but would not invite a Jewish woman. Frankenthal remembered her hurt decades later. Whereas children had the capacity to befriend each other, adult prejudices could destroy these relationships. Clearly, class prejudice played a role here too, especially in aristocratic circles. But no class remained immune, and Jews, even children, could feel a difference. Notwithstanding these varying degrees of acceptance, Jewish children also suffered upsetting moments and anti-Semitic snubs, even physical attacks. On her way to school, philosopher Hannah Arendt recalled, quote, "I found out that I was a Jew on my way to school." Some Jewish children tried in vain to make non-Jewish friends, shutting down from sadness. In Nuremberg, Alex Bein, born 1903, felt that Jews might have been secretly admired for their academics, but non-Jewish gymnasts were the most popular. He practiced gymnastics at home and took ice-cold showers to, quote, harden his body in order to make non-Jewish friends. Nevertheless, Jews remained his only close friends. Some, like Jakob Wassermann, protected their own feelings by seeing other children's slights and taunts as general rather than personal. Still, these moments of sadness lingered long enough to be recorded many years later. Even so, it is noteworthy that memoirists tended to see these as episodes in a relatively peaceful environment. Norbert Elias summarized the situation most aptly for the majority of Jewish children. He wrote, "Antisemitism was bad and distressing, but did not influence the core of our self-esteem." More tellingly, even when aware of antisemitism, Jewish children frequently sustained deep friendships with non-Jews. Around the turn of the century, 9-year-old Eva Ehrenberg, born in 1891, took antisemitism for granted in her private school in Kassel. While girlfriends from the nobility would not acknowledge her outside of school, she had non-Jewish friends and 2 lifelong non-Jewish best friends, including the daughter of an aristocrat. Indeed, in 1963, after a lifetime of correspondence, Eva could write what we can only consider a love letter from England to the aristocrat's daughter in Germany. She remembered how they first met. And I quote, "Beloved Nettie, and then we met. I can still see it now. You rushed in, light blonde. Everything was light on you. That was 56 years ago. A whole lifetime of continual friendship. But it didn't begin so easily. You came from an old, noble family. You had only known Jewish cattle dealers on your estate. You had to fight with your father in order to invite me." Ehrenberg continued that, quote, "Even Hitler could not undo our lively, warm friendship." And during the Nazi years, the friends wrote, quote, "countless letters to each other, both women empathizing with each other's good and bad luck." This letter, rare in its preservation and maybe in its sentiment, highlights that difficulties notwithstanding, friendship with non-Jewish children generally provided Jewish peers with a feeling of acceptance and safety. This is especially apparent in retrospect when memoir writers compare those relatively peaceful early school years with later, more anti-Semitic ones, especially after World War I. So, what happened after elementary education? As they grew older, Jewish children tended to draw closer to other Jews. In part, this may have been in self-defense or for cultural reasons, but it was also an imitation of their parents. The more Jews in a school, the more likely that they could preserve some Jewish group solidarity. Rahel Strauss had Christian friends, but remained closest to two other Orthodox girls. One day, a Protestant classmate asked her, "Why do you always go with the two inferior pupils? We fit together much better. My father is a pastor and yours was a rabbi. That's the same." Despite being embraced as, quote, the same, Strauss thought differently, responding that she liked the Protestant girl, but Jewish girls would be her best friends. Born in 1876 in Berlin, Kurt Rosenberg underlined the importance of self-chosen affinity groups. Quote, "There was no fundamental Jew hatred in the Nazi sense. Nevertheless, Jews associated readily among themselves or with half-Jews. But this occurred automatically and was, as it were, unconscious." Victor Klemperer, born in 1881 in Landsberg, which is today in Poland, later converted, but he felt similarly. He did not experience any overt anti-Semitism in his Berlin gymnasium. Quote, "Officially, definitely not, and unofficially, hardly. But during the Jewish holiday, one was among one's own, and in religion classes too." Further education could also divide young people, especially in villages. Proportionately more Jewish than non-Jewish teenage boys left home for further education or apprenticeships. Those who remained had longer school days and less time for camaraderie. Additionally, some young Jewish women sought further practical education out of town or moved when they married. Indeed, migration, and I would underline this, migration from towns to cities played a major role in separating schoolmates and old friends. Moreover, by the later 19th century, young adult Jews became more aware of social anti-Semitism, perhaps in contrast to their childhoods or to an earlier decade, despite the fact that anti-Semitic parties were losing support by the turn of the century. Complexities, once again. This could be seen most starkly at the university level. Universities were not ivory towers, actually ever, and especially right now. And after 1879, 1880, Jewish men could rarely escape anti-Semitism on campus. If Jewish men were looking for respect and acknowledgement, they were to be badly disappointed. In Berlin during 1880 and 1881, over 40% of the male student body signed anti-Semitic statements. And German students formed highly visible anti-Semitic fraternities, espousing a mixture of nationalism, monarchism, anti-Catholic Christianity, and anti-Semitism. The members of these fraternities argued that, quote, Jewish liberalism was the sworn enemy of Christianity, that Jews were dangerous socialists, and that although Jews, quote, improve with German education, they are just not German and can never become so, end quote. Additionally, Catholic students organized their own fraternities in the 1870s. Hostility toward Jews deteriorated to such an extent that by 1905, some German students joined a campaign sponsored by the conservative Alldeutscher Verband against the alleged overcrowding of German universities by foreign Jews. Jewish male students reacted with both outrage and sadness. Some of their fathers had been proud members of German fraternities. Their sons had grown up hearing about romantic fraternity traditions. They had looked forward to the camaraderie and colored hats of fraternity membership. Suddenly, young Jewish men found hostile fraternities that considered Jews unsuitable for the gloried tradition of excessive drinking and unworthy opponents in the barbaric but allegedly virile and much hailed ritual of dueling. Indeed, anti-Semites refused to duel with Jews since they were not seen as honorable, that is, worthy of giving what the Germans called satisfaction. Disappointingly, most Jewish male students even lost their non-Jewish high school friends when these young men joined anti-Semitic fraternities. In reaction to bigotry on campuses and corresponding to the flowering of many different kinds of Jewish organizations in the late 19th century, some Jewish men created their own fraternities. Other Jewish students became more adamantly Jewish, forming their own non-fraternity Jewish student clubs, and others found Zionism. When they finally entered the university, as I said in 1908, Jewish women, rather than founding their own clubs, joined newly forming women's clubs. In Heidelberg, the Women's Club first elected a Jewish chairperson. The umbrella organization of women students, open to all, affiliated in 1915 with the German women's movement. Anti-Semitism, however, afflicted some women too. A year after Prussian universities opened to women, a Christian national, that is, anti-Semitic women's organization formed. It combined with similar ones in 1914. And yet, despite anti-Semitic hurdles, increasing rates of intermarriage suggest that more opportunities had opened for Jews and non-Jews to become acquainted at work, at universities, and in clubs. Statistics shed light on the increasing intimacy between the Jewish minority and those in the majority. And just as a reminder, the Jewish minority is about 1% of the population, so tiny. In 1875, the introduction of civil marriage had legalized marriage between Jews and non-Jews in Germany. Given the size of the Jewish community and the difficulties of marrying within such a small population, intermarriage rates almost quadrupled from 4.6% between 1876 and 1880 to 16.28% between 1911 and 1915. The rate of intermarriages, with males in the lead, rose rapidly in the pre-war and war years, especially in the big cities. Still, we need to remember that these percentages of a tiny minority means that whereas Jewish leaders worried about intermarriages, few non-Jews may have even known about them. Intermarriages often had very romantic beginnings, unlike intra-Jewish marriages in which bourgeois parents often picked or at least influenced the choice of a partner. These couples fell in love. They then confronted their families, who accepted the decision, faced the marriages reluctantly, or expressed intense opposition. Having overcome these serious challenges, the couple achieved a happy ending, or at least a happy beginning. In 1904, Victor Klemperer, a university student, met Eva, a pianist. Years later, he wrote, "I immediately felt we belonged together." Their families opposed the relationship. Hers, although poor, stemmed from the nobility and deplored his Jewish background. His preferred a woman with money, but had no difficulty accepting her religion. His brothers had intermarried too, despite their father being a rabbi. Although we can't generalize from one love story, we can appreciate some of the mentalities and milieus in which these intermarriages took place. Young people don't usually marry the first person they date. Intermarriages show that Jews and non-Jews had ample opportunities to mix with and befriend each other, even to fall in love. Now, moving from individual moments of acceptance or rejections to group interactions, we find a great variety of Jewish relationships with non-Jews, although this varied by region, class, and the extent of urbanization. Extraordinarily complex, these relationships tended to be more formal and less intimate than those among Jews, and far more likely to take place in public rather than at home. Both informal and formal mixing can be best understood in the changing context of political anti-Semitism. The growth of anti-Semitism in the 1880s heightened non-Jewish exclusivity and Jewish defensiveness. Jews found clubs that had previously welcomed them closed and created their own. Friendships continued for some and frayed for others. Ultimately, a diverse picture of inclusions and exclusions, sometimes at the very same point, emerged. Focusing on rural and then urban settings can fill in some details. About 70% of Jews in 1871 lived in cities or towns. 30% lived in villages where neighborliness, pleasant informal contacts took place. Indeed, the idea of neighborliness includes trust and belonging, but also some distance and strangeness. That is, intimacy and sometimes conflict. With these ideas in mind, we can see how Jews and their non-Jewish neighbors navigated relationships in their villages. Most villagers viewed neighborly connections as pragmatic business relations or as a social duty, even a social necessity. In the small village of Nonnenweier, for example, Jews sometimes helped non-Jewish neighbors in the harvest, lent them money, vouched for them, offered them storage space in their own barns, or gave them advice, quote, even in matters of the heart. Peasant families brought Jews barrels of fruit, either in gratitude or in exchange for a favor, and helped Jews press juice from apples and cut cabbage for sauerkraut. Neighbors' children helped observant Jews turn on lights on the Sabbath. On special occasions, neighbors exchanged foods. Weddings remained a family affair, but Christian children attended the male coming of age ritual, the bar mitzvah, and the ensuing party. Funerals, much like sick calls, occasioned a spirit of community. In addition, attendance at funerals was often seen as a way to display respect for the deceased person and his or her family. Jews and non-Jews often attended one another's funeral processions, and sometimes the graveside rituals as well. Still, some neighbors kept their distance. Different occupations and religious practices could reinforce misunderstandings. Jews also lived a more bourgeois life, signaled by their clothing, their home furnishing, and their educational expectations for their children. Further, the churches in the small towns, particularly the local clergy, reinforced separation. Werner Kahneman commented dryly, quote, "The teaching of the church, particularly around Easter, did not provide for a friendly atmosphere." But in Baden and Württemberg, for example, Jews also noted that Protestants and Catholics treated each other similarly as outsiders. Gender roles and duties kept housewives apart. In villages, neither Jewish nor non-Jewish women engaged in leisured pleasantries. Some had attended school together, which guaranteed a level of familiarity. But as one non-Jewish woman explained, quote, "There wasn't any sitting around together. We had no time." Village girls also befriended each other, some joining gymnastics clubs, others trading books. And as we've seen, some female friendships could last for decades. Yet in some villages, Jews remained cognizant that anti-Semitism could arise if, for example, a young middle-class Jewish mother walked through town with a baby carriage, a luxury peasants couldn't afford. Aware that class differences might provoke anti-Semitism, Jews used the admonition, "Don't stoke anti-Semitism," or in German Jewish, it was "Mach keinen Risches." Clubs provided more social opportunities in village, though mostly for men. And in small towns, men of the same class could meet informally. In Zobernheim, the Stammtisch, the local table at the local tavern seem to have been completely integrated. Jewish and non-Jewish men of the lower middle classes, tailors, grocers, shop owners, regularly played cards or drank beer with each other. Middle and upper middle class men in small towns occasionally joined reading groups that attracted the more educated male citizen. From the 1870s through the heightened anti-Semitism of the 1880s, Victor Klemperer's father, a rabbi, belonged to just such a group in Brandenburg, whose members included public officials and professionals, as well as the rabbi and the minister. Gymnastics, not only the most popular sport in Germany, but also ideologically associated with ardent nationalism, attracted Jewish men who also enjoyed local riflemen's clubs, which combined nationalism with camaraderie. Annual sharpshooting tournaments included the selection of a queen of the competition, a position occasionally held by a young Jewish woman. Veterans associations, the largest mass organization in Imperial Germany, provided further opportunities for men to bond, as did volunteer firefighting units. Certainly, these men came together because they liked to sing or display their manly shooting prowess or patriotism, not as an overt act of bridge building. Still, rural historians suggest that the era before 1900 was the high point of Christian Jewish male sociability. Neighborliness could lean toward friendship. Personal home visits, however, tended to be rare. But these were rare also between non-Jewish neighbors. In a village in Lower Franconia, the Jewish teacher occasionally entertained the village pastor, who, quote, enjoyed coffee with matzah on Passover. These relationships indicate that Jews and non-Jews could cross boundaries, even as they acknowledged that the boundaries existed. In contrast to the modest number of clubs in villages and towns, social gatherings grew in importance in cities. Although historians tend to think of the imperial era as a world of stability and tradition, which it may have been for villagers, for many Jews and other Germans, this period included physical, economic, and social mobility as they moved to nearby cities. Offering integrated clubs, cities revealed dwindling divisions between Jews and non-Jews. By the late 19th century, this form of sociability was such an ingrained part of urban Jewish bourgeois life that Jews saw it as part of what it meant to be bourgeois. If you were bourgeois, you joined a club. Further, their participation announced, for all who cared to see, that they had achieved social recognition. In these rather liberal environments, a genuine test of integration would be, at least this is what I was thinking, would be how well Jews and non-Jews mixed at home. Among the very wealthiest groups, Jewish men mixed with non-Jewish men, both in public places during the day and at home, accompanied by their wives in the evening. The Hamburg factory owner, Joseph Wachtel, ate his midday meal in a restaurant with other wealthy non-Jewish merchants and members of the Hamburg Senate. His wife held a salon for Jewish and non-Jewish intellectuals in their home. Although Hamburg had a liberal reputation, this also took place in Berlin. No doubt such interactions existed, but that they might be considered friendship is still open. Many merely saw these gatherings as a way to advance careers, and others drew a line. When Gershom Scholem's father held a reception in his home, only his male colleagues attended. Had they brought their wives, they would have been obliged to invite the Scholem women in return, something they clearly intended to avoid. Urban Jews and non-Jews mingled more easily in intellectual, artistic, and bohemian circles. Max Hachenberg, born in 1860, a Jewish lawyer, and Albert Düringer, born 5 years earlier, later an eminent judge, became close friends and co-editors despite religious and political differences. They visited each other at home in Mannheim and corresponded regularly when Düringer moved away. When Düringer died in 1924, Hachenberg gave the eulogy at his friend's funeral. In Insterburg, East Prussia, Kurt Blumenfeld, born 1884 and later a Zionist leader, took great interest in the arts and music, noting, quote, "My parents' relations consisted entirely of intellectually and musically interested non-Jews." Several examples illuminate Jewish social integration and its limits. The Heilbrut family of Frankfurt provides a striking case. Although the head of the family participated in mixed social and political associations, he had even been a mayoral candidate in 1913. He never entertained a non-Jew in his home. Other wealthy Jews in places as diverse as Frankfurt or Karlsruhe or Königsberg invited Jews and non-Jews to dinner party, but the guests remained predominantly Jewish. Even among the most integrated Jews, including converts and intermarriages, the successful banker Karl Furstenberg noted that Jews often relied on each other. So what did Jewish participation mean within non-Jewish groups? The attitudes of liberal Freemasons may be indicative. By the mid-1870s, especially in places like Hamburg and Frankfurt, Jewish Freemasons could feel that they were an important part of German lodge sociability without having to relinquish their Jewish identity. In the wake of the anti-Semitic agitation of the 1880s, however, a number of lodges politicized Jewish membership, no longer accepting Jews. Some non-Jewish Freemasons, angered by the illiberalism of their brothers, formed a new set of lodges in the 1880s, which not only welcomed Jews, but given the anti-Semitism of the time, was comprised largely of Jews. In response to the anti-Semitism of the 1880s, and as an assertion of independence, Jewish men founded the B'nai B'rith Order in Berlin in 1882, exclusively open to middle-class Jewish men. Many middle-class people joined more than one organization. Jewish women, for example, entered Jewish groups as well as the Froebel societies, attracted by their progressive ideas about childhood education. In the 1890s, Jewish and non-Jewish women established close ties in cities like Königsberg, where a number of Jewish women led the major non-sectarian women's organizations. In the small city of Witten, at least 4 Jewish women co-founded the local patriotic women's group. At the national level, too, Jewish women held prominent positions in the women's movement, even as anti-Semitic campaigns grew in society. About a third of the leaders of the early feminist movement, oops, I'm setting my alarm so that I wouldn't overspeak, so I'm gonna have to cut down a little bit. But let me, all right, enough of this. At the national level, too, Jewish women held prominent positions in the women's movement, even as the anti-Semitic campaigns grew. About a third of the leaders of the early feminist movement were Jewish or of Jewish origin. And yet, despite, or maybe because of, increasing Jewish acculturation and integration, anti-Semitism persisted and grew. I'm going to skip a little bit, but I don't want to skip the feminist movement. I want to add a little bit about how some Jewish feminists maintained friendships with non-Jewish women that went beyond these organizations. In Berlin, an activist and author like Hedwig Dohm invited women and men of all confessions to her home. She had close relationships with non-Jewish intellectual women. Rosa Vogelstein founded a branch of the German feminist movement in Stettin. She was a rabbi's wife. She and several leaders of the German Women's Association, all non-Jews, were very close friends, visiting each other at home regularly. So deep friendships did develop from some of these encounters. Even anti-Semites noticed this, accusing Jews of, quote, ostentatious charity intended as a means to an end, integration. Let's look now at World War I, because as I've described to you, this was a period in which Jews were in organizations, were not allowed in organizations, were leading some of the organizations. So it's a very, very mixed picture. But World War I then changes things. World War I heightened the complexity of the relationships between Jews and other Germans. The situation looked promising at first, as the emperor included Jews, quote, recognizing only Germans, end quote. The playwright Ernst Toller applauded. The Kaiser recognized no parties. All factions were to be united. Everybody defended one mother, Germany. But he also observed, we were living in a state of emotional delirium. Jewish organizations, newspapers, and individuals professed their unconditional love of Germany. Adolf Riesenfeld, who considered himself a pacifist, felt drawn to this, quote, purely defensive war and cheered the soldiers. Jewish women, like many other women, were, quote, gripped by the same fervor. And yet, early military successes gave even some enthusiastic Jews pause. At the end of 1915, Bertold Freudenthal, who prayed for German victory, asked his diary, quote, what will the new Germany look like? Uneasily, he replied, outwardly perfect, inwardly a great deal of self-confidence, indifference toward the interests of others increased to brutality, many prejudices also against Jews. Setbacks at the front turned public opinion openly against Jews. In October 1916, the War Ministry decided to count the number of Jews in the military, implying they were shirkers, but never publicizing the findings. Although Jewish organizations later proved this assertion false, the Jew count turned private grumbling into a public political act. Jews' brief honeymoon as ostensibly full-fledged Germans ended abruptly. In conclusion, we've seen the capricious relationship between Jewish intentions and historical events. Sometimes they worked hand in hand, as during the mid-19th century struggle for emancipation, when industrialization and liberalism helped advance Jewish aspirations. And at other times they were at odds, as during the 1880s and World War I, when Jews demonstrated their patriotism and still faced anti-Semitism. Jewish integration was neither smooth nor certain. The political ambiance of the generation in which a person lived had a crucial impact. Different generations of Jews perceived their situation depending on their success or frustrations. Those who experienced official inequality before 1871, and then the onset of emancipation in what they called the, quote, peaceful optimistic century, remained hopeful. Their children, brought up in the imperial era, faced the uneven, dizzying roller coaster of opportunity and anti-Semitism, and were often more pessimistic about Jewish integration. These shifting allegiances affected and reflected Jews' differing self-definitions. Jacob Wasserman, born 1873, described his anguish, quote, German Jew, one has to emphasize both words thoroughly. His twofold love and his battle on two fronts drive him to the brink of despair. Yet others, like Gustav Landauer, born 1870, the cultural critic and anarchist whose life spanned the entire imperial era, exemplifies another group of Jews, those who insisted on fluid identities. In 1913, he wrote, quote, I have never had the need to simplify myself or to create an artificial unity. I accept my complexity and hope to be even more many-sided. Jews thus bridged two worlds, depending on political and social eras. In liberal times, they maintained intense relationships with their Jewish families, friends, clubs, and communities, while interacting with non-Jewish Germans in public, charitable, professional, and business organizations, even some friendships, forming their own clubs and organizations they joined non-Jewish groups and associations too, mingling in and also subsidizing secular, civic, and cultural organizations. In periods of increasing anti-Semitism, they turned inward in pain and anger. As a result of such unpredictable contingencies, relationships with other Jews took up the majority of Jewish social life. Still, Jews found themselves more integrated than at any time in prior German history. Many of their relationships would fall into what Georg Simmel called differentiated friendships that connect individuals according to common intellectual interests, experiences, careers, or situations in life. These friendships maintained a degree of reserve, avoiding certain areas of interest and feeling. Yet some of these links led to great affection, and some even ended in marriage. At greater or lesser emotional cost to themselves, Jews continued to build their families, careers, communities, their futures, quote, at home in Germany, end quote, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaplan. Everybody would be clapping right now, or people are clapping in the.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna give time for people to put. We have a couple of questions, but I'm gonna ask one of my questions, and then if people want to type their questions in the chat, that would be great. So much. Thank you so much for this talk. It's so rich, and there's so many threads in it, which is something that I really admire about your work. And I think like history as a discipline, we allow for this kind of complexity, but then it is very hard to deal with such complex material, to have, right, to kind of square it at the end and say like, what should we take away? But I feel like you've balanced that really beautifully. And one thing that comes up for me, it's just all the stuff about the small towns. And I can't help but kind of listen to the talk and then think about some of your other work and about how the small towns are so hostile in the Nazi period. And it seems like people who live in small, I think this is from Between Dignity and Despair, but that people who were in rural areas realized before people who lived in the big cities just how anti-Semitic their neighbors were. And then some of those stories that you tell about funerals in particular, they're just like right, like hostility at funerals in small towns. So what do you make of that contrast?
How do you explain it? I'm not sure. One thing, and the fact that small towns were so hostile is also proven by the fact that Jews leave those small towns as fast as they can to go to big cities, right? Is during the 30s, because the small towns are so personally hostile. And I think number one, it has to do with everybody knew who the Jews were. And if they're being influenced by Nazi propaganda and suddenly seeing their former Jewish friends as well, not so they weren't such good friends, or well, they tried to make money out of me, or Jews were small tradespeople. They owned shops. They were cattle dealers and horse dealers. So they were in a business where the farmers, the peasants needed them, but also resented them. So, I mean, it's really interesting because when the Nazis started arguing and insisting that the peasants stop buying from Jews, peasants took a long time to stop buying from Jews because they got better deals. But on the other hand, they were very openly anti-Semitic. So, I mean, I can't explain it besides human, fallibility and confusion.
Wild, yeah. Okay, thanks for that. Okay. Okay, so we've got some questions. One is that so this person asked, can you comment about Fritz Haber? I'm not sure if we could ask that person to elaborate or if that, and another question is, or sorry, do you want?
No, I mean, I don't know what I'm supposed to comment about for
Yeah,
topic.
okay, so maybe that person can come back to that. Oh, okay. A developer, fertilizer, Nobel Prize winner.
Oh, I know who he is, but I
Yeah,
don't know what the
what
question.
specifically? Yeah. Okay,
Well, I mean, he was this hyper German patriot, hyper super duper German patriot, and he was happy to provide, gas for the German armies in World War One. But I don't know what the question is really.
and certainly there are some prominent Jewish Germans who are hyper patriotic throughout the war and support the Kaiser. I I I always understood because they saw 1871 as a moment that had liberated or that had brought emancipation, so they were tied to the imperial project. Is that right?
Would think yes, but also that when the Kaiser, embraced them, embraced all, I know only Germans. That was so important. This is after the 1880s and all the
Right.
anti-Semitism in the Kaiser's circle too. And then you suddenly, he's embracing, and we're going to work really hard to provide for our nation and to be worthy of the Kaiser's embrace, but at the same time, they're worried about it.
It's fascinating. Um, okay, so let me do a couple more. Okay, so someone asked, what percentage of Jews in Imperial Germany are religiously observant? And does the degree of religiosity influence how much they're discriminated against or what kind of experiences they have of anti-Semitism?
That's a really good question. I mean, at that period, I'd say oh, 10 to 15% are Orthodox or what considered Orthodox. But Orthodox in Germany, there's a very nice book, old book by now, by a man named Breuer. And Orthodox in Germany was highly acculturated. I mean, they read Goethe and they read Schiller and they read their Hebrew, prayer books, but they were very acculturated. Um, I don't think I don't think there was you wouldn't be able to see the difference. An Orthodox man would look very much like a non-Jewish man, except he'd be wearing a hat, but the same clothing. So you wouldn't see much of a difference. And he would send his sons and to the university. And I was quoting Victor Klemper's father, who was a rabbi, and three of his kids intermarried. They were very highly acculturated. More, and he wasn't Orthodox. I would call him more, well, he wasn't liberal either. He was sort of in between, the father. So it's really hard to know what a non-Jew would think of a person who looked just like him.
Are so in Weimar, there's a migration of Jews over Germany's eastern border, and then there's a tension. But is that more of a Weimar? That's more in the Weimar period. You don't.
That happened to the it starts in the 1880s and 90s. And I think I quoted early 1900s, German students are saying, we don't want any more foreigners. It's very typical, but you have a much bigger percentage coming in later. And they do dress differently. They are seen by Germans as either far right, Orthodox, ultra Orthodox, wearing the clothing and distinguishing themselves from the average German, or far left communist. So then you get during Weimar, you get all of, and you also get like a pogrom in Berlin in the Scheunenviertel, because the right wing is worrying about these Jewy Jews and these communist Jews. So they painted, and basically these were refugees from Eastern Europe. These were immigrants who were working as artisans. They were working in cigarette factories. They were working in clothing factories. They were workers.
Thank you. Okay. All right. So this is from my. This is a question about a a movie. So if you haven't seen the movie, that just say I haven't seen this movie. So it's a 2011 documentary called The Flat by Arnon Goldfinger
Seen it.
about okay, so he uncovered his German-born Jewish grandparents' friendships with Leopold von Mildenstein and his wife. Von Mildenstein went on to head the SS Office of Jewish Affairs, preceding Eichmann in that role. In the film, the filmmaker's befuddled by learning that his grandparents' friendship with these people developed before the Second World War and then resumed after. Wow, I have to see this. Okay, what do you make of this? Is it exceptional? Did you see similar or not? Thank you.
It's a very good question. It's a great film. It's a film that also shows how German Jews were, and how bourgeois in this particular case. And the Israeli grandchildren are clueless as to how could this be. Um, I think it's rare, really rare, that people would have been friends with someone who then became a Nazi and then stayed friends with them afterwards. But Mary Fulbrook, who is a well-known German historian, she's English, British, she just wrote a book about something similar where her grandparents die and she finds letters in the attic, and there some famous Nazi who ran a small town in Poland. I'm forgetting the name because she wrote a book about it then. And so those are the two examples I know. Generally, there were people, even in my own circles, my mother, for example, who retained friendships with anti-Nazi friends from their small towns after the war. So that was pretty common. There were people who were friendly with people they'd gone. It's always what that's why I broke this up into elementary school and high school and college, because they have a lot of meaningful friendships in elementary school, less so in high school, and hardly at all in the university, because the universities are so anti-Semitic. Women less than men, but still, very nationalist. So yeah, there were friendships with German non-Jews, but not German Nazis, at least not to my knowledge.
Okay, let me see here. Um, oh, this is interesting. Do you know anything about the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish community in Hamburg during this period? Like interactions with the broader Jewish community or responses to anti-Semitism?
Um, I don't know that much about it. There was a the Gemeinde, there's I forget the German word now, but there's one Jewish community. So the Sephardi community and the Ashkenazi community were under the head of one Jewish community. I don't know much about their relationships with each other. I do know that a good number of the Sephardi left and went to Portugal. And I've actually traced them in my last book. They left early, and because they were Sephardi, they were able to make connections with Jews in Portugal, and so they were saved. But I don't know much about their relationships to the Ashkenazi Jews.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so here's a question. So you mentioned anti-Semitism in the talk today. The Jewish community is driven by competing definitions of anti-Semitism, or what should or should not be classified. In the period you're discussing, did people agree about what anti-Semitism was and what sort of phenomenon it encompassed? Were there competing definitions, and were there gray areas or limit cases? Yeah, that's fascinating. I've never thought about that.
Yeah, I haven't either. I mean, there was no Israel, right? So that's already simplifies it. And in the cases that I've come across, Germans are overtly anti-Semitic. They're not politely anti-Semitic. The German students don't want Jewish students there. They sign petitions. German universities let Jewish students in because you come in by an exam. You don't come in by like an interview, like when Columbia University used to have quotas against Jews. That was, then that was you'd have an interview and you'd be told, well, they're not really genteel enough or gentile enough or whatever. That was very different. So I would say that what the definition of anti-Semitism was, I mean, for example, if you were um, if you were Jewish up until Weimar, you couldn't become a full professor. You couldn't become an officer in the army. There were certain places you just couldn't go. And
Yeah.
then afterwards, if you converted, you could, and in Weimar, you were able to. So in Weimar, I think that one thing we have to keep in mind is in Weimar, a lot of Jews were able to be in positions they would have never been in before. They were qualified, but they were Jewish, so they weren't allowed in. But in Weimar, then they were allowed in. Um, so I think the definition of anti-Semitism was the dislike or hatred of Jews. Very simple. It didn't involve, do you support this country? Do you support this country's actions? Nothing like that. So maybe they had it a little easier than we do today.
So they retain the civil service exclusions last until Weimar.
Yes. Yeah.
That's okay. That's really helpful. Um, uh, okay, fascinating. Oh,
Not 100%. I mean, I also know examples of a Jewish postmaster shouldn't have been there before Weimar. So there were some, there were exceptions.
so because I talk and I don't know much about this topic at all, but I do a little bit of like Imperial to Weimar, and I always talk about Walter Rathenau and his family, and then I talk about Tony Sender, and I think Tony Sender is more of a example of Weimar as this like she's not the only Jewish woman elected to the parliament in Weimar. There's three or four, and but Rathenau is sort of a mixed, right? Because it's amazing that he's the foreign minister and then he's assassinated by anti-Semites. So it's like kind of how do you read this pattern?
Well, that's
Uh,
the rise of anti-Semitism. I mean, that's already big time after World War One. You know,
I'm, having, yeah, I think I don't see as much anti-Semitism as in Weimar as I ever expected to see. Um, yeah, but I mean, it's more certainly it's more apparent than before the First World War.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's there. It's there.
yeah. Um,
And partly because Jews are doing well, because there are more Jewish judges now, and there are more Jewish high-level civil servants. And, suddenly the right is saying, well, where'd they all come from? Well, they all came from the fact that they were discriminated against in the last regime. So,
it's so fascinating too that you said like Adolf Stoker, like those parties fail, and yet then because there are these explicit anti-Semitic parties in Germany in the late 19th century, one of them run by a guy named Adolf, and nobody remembers, and they're failures, and yet then there's this social wave.
yeah, I think that's important. The political wave and the social wave. The political wave could actually fail. It could die out as it did in 1904. By that time, there were hardly any anti-Semitic parties worth mentioning. But the social remains on some level. I mean, that happens in America too. That could happen in the next election. The right could fail, but there could still be social anti-Semitism. It's not that surprising.
Okay, so maybe we should segue into so one question is, do you have insight on the current moment? So I mean, just the complexity of how racism works, I think, is a really important insight from this work, if you ask me.
I don't want to really comment on today because it's just too complex. And I'm going to miss something and then I'm going to be mad at myself. But basically, it's it's a long, long, long conversation with two or three people, not just with me.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. Thank you for fascinating lecture. Can you say more about like the cultural constructions of friendship? So this is also like a fascinating question. So late 19th century friendship, what does it mean to be a friend? And I mean, one of your people had never had anyone over to their house. That was really interesting to me.
Never had
Um,
a non-Jewish person over to their house.
non-Jewish person over their house.
Right.
Yeah. And then you said, well, they didn't have Jewish people over in the village, but actually they didn't really have that many people And then, so also this question is interested in like differences. Like, are there particular kind of Imperial German models of friendship versus?
Yeah, well, that's something that I'm actually still looking into. But I was at a conference recently on neighbors and neighborliness that can turn into friendship. But it was very complicated because the children could be very close friends. The mothers could talk to each other or garden alongside each other. Um, and the husbands would never talk to each other. So it's like, and it not because they were hostile, just because they weren't interested in each other. So the friendships are very, very complicated, and then they change over time. So and Jews, one thing I didn't say in this talk, but I should have, is Jews migrated more than non-Jews. So that Jews actually lost their connections to the villages much sooner than the non-Jewish population. They wanted to move to cities so their kids could get more education, more apprenticeships, more internships, like intern with your uncle at your uncle's store, that kind of thing. And so they left their villages and their small towns. So they lost those early friendships. I mean, there's one story in the book Between Dignity and Despair where a Jewish woman is arrested and she's in jail, and she calls the mayor and she says, "How dare you put me in jail?" He was a good friend of hers from school. And she's like, aren't you ashamed of yourself that you put me in jail? And then he lets her out. So, it depends on how long you've known somebody and how closely. There's definitely, I think there are two things I'd want to say. A German and a German non-Jew and a German non-Jew could have distance between each other too. It's a formal society, and aside from the Stammtisch and the beer garden, it wasn't very homey. There was no coming into the home stuff, and that
Uh,
was pretty typical.
um,
But with Jews, I think it's even more complicated. You could have friends, or the girls could be friends, but the mothers wouldn't talk to each other, like in that aristocratic story by Goethe Frankenthal. That was her best friend, but she couldn't go to the birthday party because the mothers wouldn't invite the mother to come into the house. So on every level, it's very complicated.
this is sort of following up to that. So this interesting question about kind of about gender and friendship, and then so one of the stories about that I think it was non-Jewish husbands came over, but they didn't bring their non-Jewish wives because then they would have had to invite the Jewish women to their house. Could you talk about like,
That was
um,
the
why was it, so the question is why it wasn't okay for Jewish women to accompany their husbands for some of these gatherings in non-Jewish homes, where
okay.
wife normally have been included.
So that's interesting. So Gershom Schollem's father is celebrating, I think, his business's 25th anniversary or something. So he has an open house and invites all his colleagues and all the people like at his level, in other businesses. And they all come without their wives. Now he's invited them, but the assumption was you can invite them and they would come with people, with their families. They don't come with their families. And then Scholem replies, or he announces that if they had come with their wives, then those families would have had to invite the Jews back to their homes, which they didn't want to do. Okay, so it's a tit for tat. Okay, if
And
I
they
my
sort of,
wife, then my wife and I have to invite your wife. We don't want to do that. So that was the reason. So there are all different levels and gradations of this friendship routine too. In fact, be very interesting to see if there, and I don't think there is, a comparison between American and German friendships in the late 19th century. What did they look like? It's what comes to mind is also Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, where he says one of the reasons people start to lose friends and lose connections is because they don't have front porches. When people had front porches, people would stop by on their way, just walking back and forth and chat and say hello and become friendlier. And I don't know, they didn't have front porches in Germany. They had the well, they had the beer garden, and people had their backyards where they grew stuff. And I'm talking about the villages now.
yeah.
Uh, Never been to these medieval towns. There are no front porches. It's like it'd be a waste of space, I guess.
It reminds me of, I took German in Berlin, and my teacher had grown up in East Berlin, and she talked about how they didn't have phones, but they had these boards on their apartment door. So if you wanted to see your friend, you would go and knock on the door, and if they weren't there, you would leave a note. And she said it was really sociable because you were always running into people or leaving notes, and that she missed that about it, about socialism, about actually existing socialism. Yeah, the kind of structural and architectural things that form these relationships. Okay, so question, or do you want to?
Well, I just wanted to say in the late 19th century, there were examples in the villages of the one phone in the village, or the early 20th, was the Jewish family had a phone. And so they let a lot of people come in and use it. And that was like a generous, friendly thing to do. But those families also had pianos and they had nice rugs. And that caused some jealousy. So it's really complicated.
And it's also, I mean, the stakes for us, like hearing these stories, the stakes are so high because we know what's gonna happen. And yeah, it's really.
Know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. Oh, you mean for the Nazi period? I thought you meant now for us.
Oh no, oh my God, no, no, yeah, no, for the Nazi period. No, like when you had the peasants were bringing the barrels of fruit, and I was like, oh, those same peasants a couple of decades later are gonna just be horribly anti-Semitic. Like it's,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's really yeah. Okay, so question. Oh yeah, I'm so glad this person asked this question. I was also curious about this. Do you see regional differences? So like Catholic Bavaria, Southern Germany versus the Protestant North, or Breslau. I was wondering if like the East versus like the West would be like closer to the kind of centers of culture in the East and versus like Cologne, or not to mention the higher percentage of, so there are more Jews, and like I think the community in Berlin is the largest, and it's
Berlin, Frankfurt, Hamburg,
and
Munich.
it and it's more, the population of Berlin is higher than 1% Jewish population. It would
4%.
4%.
Yeah.
Wow, it's still not. Yeah,
4%, it's 4% is small for Berlin, but it's 30% of Jews.
wow.
A lot of Jews but it's still, I mean, there aren't that many Jews to begin with. So
It's a tiny minority of
yes,
people.
so the question of regional differences, yes and no. Um, Bavaria, I'd say it was more country versus city, because I'm thinking if you look at Bavaria and then you look at Schleswig-Holstein, let's say like, peasants in the north and peasants in the south, they're very anti-Semitic, especially where there are fewer Jews in the north, like Schleswig was very, very anti-Semitic. But the cities were generally similar. They allowed openings for Jews to especially become involved in cultural, social organizations. So I wouldn't say I could see any difference between Breslau and Frankfurt. I mean, just that, Hamburg and Frankfurt and Berlin had a lot more Jews. So you would say possibly, and I don't know this, but possibly there were more Jewish clubs and Jewish organizations where there are a lot of Jews. Where there are very few Jews, you could also assume there would be more integration because the Jews would want to have more connections. On the other hand, Berlin with a bazillion, I skipped this part, a bazillion clubs, thousands of clubs all over Germany, they would have to also integrate. They would do both. There were Jewish clubs, and then there were Jewish non-Jewish clubs. So I think the difference is really village versus city, not so much region. And Catholic Protestant, that's really hard to say. In most studies during the Nazi period, it seems like Jews were more comfortable in Catholic areas than in Protestant areas. But I don't know for sure how that worked in every city and every village. I just don't know.
So that brings up something I wanted to ask about, which is it seems like, I mean, that one of your sources or more noticed that there's an uptick in anti-Semitism around Easter.
Yeah, they
Wow.
all said, yeah.
So how anti-Semitic was your typical Easter service?
Well, I mean, we're talking Catholic now, right? We're not talking so much Protestant, but the Catholic Church really seemed to rile people up at Easter. And not just in Germany, but for example, when I was studying Portugal, Easter wasn't a good time for Jews to be wandering around. So there was hostility.
Do
And
you across the Oberammergau, like the famous passion play that's been performed
I mean,
for what?
it's still performed.
Yeah, it still performs.
Yeah.
I mean, that was hyper anti-Semitic in the Nazi period, but it must have also been anti-Semitic in the imperial period. I hadn't really thought that through.
I'm thinking it's also anti-Semitic in the current situation, current day. So, but we were talking about this new definition of anti-Semitism that is being proposed in the United States Congress and that just passed the House, which is a sign it might pass the Senate, but I don't know. But the far right in the House wouldn't vote for it because they felt that then they couldn't say that Christ was killed by Jews. That would be forbidden by this new law. So they didn't vote for it. So that idea, as old as it is and as overturned as it's been by the Catholic Church itself, doesn't seem to make an impression. So, and the people who oppose it now aren't Catholic. What's her name? Marjorie Taylor Greene's not Catholic. I
That's
forgot.
yeah,
Some
that's
form
incredible.
of,
I
yeah, Protestantism of some sort.
That's incredible. Yeah. Um, okay, so I think we've got time for one more here. Um, I think this is a really good question. So in Imperial Germany, we're talking like 19th century. How long have Jews been living in Germany? Like how many generations?
Oh, I can't tell you generations, but the the historical data says since 300, since the year 300. So you can figure that out, it's 1600 years, something like that. How
It's
many generations would that be? Like
a
from
lot,
19
a lot of generations. It's before Christianity, right? There's evidence of
Romans. It's the
people, and
Romans.
it's
It's
the
the
Romans.
Yeah, it's sorry, I didn't make that clear. It's the Romans, and you can see some of those old Jewish, I don't know what you call them, archaeological uh, materials in Cologne, because it starts in Cologne. Jews settle in Cologne. So, yeah, so generations, I don't know. I don't know how long. Is a generation, what, 30 years? I have no idea. Generations used to be 20 years, and they were 30 years.
I have
So
no idea. I don't even know if I'm in Gen X. That's all I know.
I didn't even know. Yeah, I didn't know I can't follow them. So
I think it's
much.
getting a little late, the whole yeah. Um, okay, well, I think we should wrap it up there. This was fascinating. Thank you so much. And thank you
I
so
think
much.
everybody.
Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for all these great, I'm sorry we did not get to all the questions. Um,
If anybody wants
that's
to write,
great, Erica. That's what we're talking about. Sorry, Marion.
if anybody wants to write a question to me, they can do that. It's very easy. It's marionkaplan@yahoo.com. So I'm happy to answer anything I can.
And can you say again the name of the movie that
Oh, it's called The Flat.
the
And
flat
in German, it's called Die Wohnung.
Die Wohnung.
And it's an Israeli filmmaker. It's really a fabulous film.
Is it Goldfinger is the guy, the
Well,
filmmaker?
I don't know I'm not good at filmmakers, but it's definitely a worthwhile film.
And people can check out Marion's books as well if you want to follow up on the Imperial story. And thank you so much for coming. And we will see everybody in person on Thursday.
I hope so. I hope that works out. Thank you all for your attention.